right, guys. Thanks again for being flexible. Hopefully, everybody turned in their awakening essays and will be studying hard and ready for your test next class period. So, let's talk about naturalism. Okay, this is our last literary movement of this unit. And naturalism is actually what we call an extreme form of realism. It doesn't have separate dates. In fact, it falls under the umbrella of realism as a literary movement. So you can think of naturalism as kind of an extension of realism. And basically, we have here the influence by Charles Darwin, who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And he is the scientist slash philosopher who wrote about these ideas of evolution and the origin of species, which was an incredibly influential text in this time period. And so that notion of as a species propagates, the most fit survive, carried over into the philosophy and thinkers of the time period and applied to their view of humanity. And so that the way the naturalist authors viewed the world was they saw the universe, nature in particular, as hostile towards humanity. All right, so humans are fated to live in this hostile environment. And according to them, our behavior is determined by the environment. So there's really not a whole lot of choice in this type of worldview. You are a product of your environment. Our instincts are towards survival and really downplays humanity in general and lines us up more with kind of those animalistic instincts. I hope that makes sense. But the naturalists were also strongly influenced by a fatalism as one of their really strong philosophical ideas. And again, you can see that emphasis on the lack of human choice, how whatever is going to happen to you is going to happen to you, and you don't have a whole lot. It's not so much man can determine his own destiny, but you are fated to live out a certain destiny. So kind of a negative worldview, and if you did the reading for today, The Law of Life and The Open Boat, you can see that it's kind of a worldview that doesn't give a whole lot of purpose to humanity. Like I said, really lumping us in with the animals in that we are just struggling for survival here on this hostile planet, and only the strong will survive, and there's not a whole lot you can do about your fate or your destiny because that's predetermined by the world we live in. So hopefully that makes sense, taking realism to the extreme in what we call naturalism. So we're studying two naturalist authors, Jack London and Stephen Crane. So we'll start with the short story, right? Law of Life was nice and short, so let's talk about Jack London here. He lived from 1876 to 1916. So as you can see, he didn't live very long. He lived longer than Stephen Crane, though, so that's something, right? And he grew up in San Francisco. We haven't had a whole lot of writers yet from out west, but he is one of our California authors. And had kind of a rough childhood. There was just a lot going on with his family. His father abandoned his mother, and she got remarried later, and just a lot of complications. And so even as a teenager, he was, your book says he sailed San Francisco Bay as an oyster pirate. So he was an adventurer from a young age, and hanging out with all these different sailors, started what would later become full-blown alcoholism that really followed him around his whole life, and many people attributed his somewhat early death to that struggle with alcoholism. He's also well known as a proponent of socialism. And to give you some context, so this is pre-World War I and World War II, and so socialism doesn't have the negative Like, we don't think Red China, communism, we don't think all that yet. It's just kind of, oh, there's an interesting idea. What does it mean to be a socialist? Oh, and socialism is one of those ideas that in theory is great, right? Like, let's share all of our wealth, and every man gets equal distribution. And so that was something, in fact, he even ran for mayor of Oakland a few times on the socialist ticket, but he didn't win either time. What he's most famously associated with, though, is the Klondike Gold Rush. And so in the late 1800s, people struck gold in the Yukon, in Alaska Territory. And so there was this huge rush to the Klondike to look for gold. And that's where Jack London, he was part of that, got a lot of the context for his story. So you probably have either read The Call of the Wild or White Fang, both set in that type of setting in Alaska. So in The Law of Life here, we also see that. So that's something that's really famously associated with him. All right, so let's talk The Law of Life. All right, my favorite thing about this story is our protagonist's name, Koskoosh. It's really fun to say, Koskoosh. So Koskoosh, his position in the tribe is that he used to be chief, and now his son is chief. All right, it's interesting that we have someone who is of great authority, right, in the tribe, or who has had great authority in the past. His son now has strong authority in the tribe. However, he is being left behind. If you read the story carefully, it was easy to see why. He has become old and frail and can no longer keep up with the tribe as they migrate to a new area. So they leave him behind to die, and that is their custom. And you can see here again really clearly those concepts of naturalism, the survival of the fittest. So let's read a little bit and just get a feeling for what's going on. Let's see. Look at the bottom of page 1043. So if you haven't opened your books yet, open up to page 1043. So he's sitting there thinking, he's been contemplating. He does have a little bit of nervousness about what's about to happen. Towards the bottom of the page, though, like the last 4 or 5 lines on the page, it says, his son was good to do this thing. He remembered other old men whose sons had not waited after the tribe, but his son has. He wandered away into the past till the young man's voice brought him back. Is it well with you? He asked. And the old man answered, it is well. All right, so then they have this conversation, and his son is like, here's your stack of wood, and here's the fire, which to me almost seems more cruel. Like, we don't want to see you freezing to death, so we're just going to leave you with the fire and a stack of wood, so you just have this extra amount of time to sit here by yourself and contemplate the end of life. I don't know, maybe that's just me. That seems extra cruel, but I don't know. And so the son, it's like, it's time for us to go. We have to follow the food. And he says, about 5-6 lines in on page 1044, he says, I go now. Is it well? And then Koskoosh says, it is well. I am as a last year's leaf clinging lightly to the stem. The first breath that blows and I fall. My voice has become like an old woman's. My eyes no longer show me the way of my feet, and my feet are heavy, and I am tired. It is well. So you can see in general his attitude towards being left behind is resignation, understanding, contentment. He is like, all right, this is just what we do, and it's time, I can't keep up anymore, so it's time for me to be left behind to die. And if you look, I'll read a little bit more. If you look further down the page, we see here the title line of the story. So this paragraph right in the middle of the page, it says, he did not complain. It was the way of life, and it was just. He had borne close to the earth had he lived, and the law thereof was not new to him. It was the law of all flesh. Nature was not kindly to the flesh. She had no concern for that concrete thing called the individual. Her interest lay in the species, the race. And so this brings us to something that's really common in the naturalist stories, and that is the personification of nature. We see this in both the law of life and the open boat, how the authors treat nature as this force in the story, right? Capital N, nature. I guess I should have capitalized it in my PowerPoint. But basically, nature does not care about individual mankind. Nature is only interested in the survival of the species of humankind. So does it matter that Koskoosh is being left to die? No, he's already had his kids. He's already done his job. And so there is no compassion. Nature has no compassion on him in his last hours here, waiting for death. So, it's kind of sad. And it goes on to talk about how nature did not care, and, it was no big deal. So, poor old Koskoosh just sitting around. So he's got this time, right? Sit around and contemplate life. So he remembers lots of things. He remembers a missionary who came. He remembers leaving his own father to die. He remembers a famine. But the most significant memory, or the one that the author spends the most time on, is where he remembers he and his buddy tracking this old moose that was being attacked by wolves, right? So look at page 1045, about 2/3 of the way down the page. He remembered when a boy, during a time of plenty, when he saw a moose being pulled down by the wolves. Xingha lay with him in the snow and watched. Xingha, who later became the craftiest of hunters, and who in the end fell through an air hole on the Yukon. They found him a month afterward, just as he had crawled halfway out and frozen stiff to the ice. Well, that's depressing, right? But the moose, so he's like, he's like all old people. He just kind of goes off these little trails. So Xingha and he had gone out that day to play at hunting after the manner of their fathers. On the bed of the creek, they struck the fresh track of a moose, and with it the tracks of many wolves. An old one, Xingha, who was quicker at reading the sign, said, an old one who cannot keep up with the herd. The wolves have cut him out from his brothers, and they will never leave him. All right, so the purpose of this memory in particular is that, now, I hope you can see this parallel. Koskoosh is the old moose, right? Like, he has been separated from his herd, and they've gone off without him. And death is close on his heels, and he has no hope, right? He has no hope of living. So we have this whole description of the moose and how it would, stop and fight the wolves and then keep running and then stop and fight the wolves. And it's described in this very magnificent way that his last fight for survival was really glamorous for these boys to watch. So they saw the end. The difference, though, between the moose and Koskoosh is that his fight with death was temporary. Now, here's something really interesting, and I like how London gives this nod to human nature. So look at the bottom of page 1046. All right, so about 6-7 lines up from the bottom. It says, for a while he listened to the silence. Perhaps the heart of his son might soften, and he would come back with the dogs to take his old father on with the tribe, to where the caribou ran thick and the fat hung heavy upon them. He strained his ears, his restless brain for the moment stilled. Not a stir, nothing. He alone took breath in the midst of the great silence. It was very lonely. So he actually has this moment where in his humanity, he says, maybe my son will come back and take me with him. He has this hope. And I think that's interesting because it parallels with at the very beginning of the story. I didn't read you this line, but he actually does have a little moment of fear and panic, right? So as much as overall he's very resigned and content with his death, he still has those survival instincts within him, right? Like that will to live is it's very deeply ingrained in our humanity. All right, so at the top of page 1047, he sees the moose again. It's very graphic. It says the old bull moose, torn flanks and bloody sides, the riddled mane and the great branching horns down low and tossing to the last. He saw the flashing forms of gray, so he sees the wolf. And then the next paragraph, and this is where it gets really creepy. A cold muzzle thrust against his cheek, and at its touch his soul leaped. All right, so there are two different ways you could read the ending here. And I don't have this in the notes, but to me this is always fascinating. When you first read this story, did you read it as a literal reading that wolves were coming to kill him? Which it could definitely be read that way, right? That there are wolves who have found him and they're going to kill him and eat him, right? And it talks about how the wolf, they get close to the fire, and at first he fights back, right? At first he picks up one of the sticks from the fire and waves it around. And then if you look at the last 5 lines of the story, it says, "Why should he cling to life?" he asked, and dropped the blazing stick into the snow. It sizzled and went out. The circle grunted uneasily but held its own. Again he saw the last stand of the old bull moose, and Koskoosh dropped his head wearily upon his knees. What did it matter after all? Was it not the law of life? So he ends in resignation. Another thought for you is that the wolves could be figurative. They could be metaphorically representing death. Just the cold, that he's not going to feed the fire anymore and he's just going to give up and die there in the cold. So whether the wolves are literal or figurative, it's really up to your interpretation. And then I always ask my students if you're sympathetic with the tribe's custom, and that's just something to think about. Like, if you lived in that context, would you be able to leave your parent or grandparent behind? And you have to consider if that's all you knew and if that was your way of life, then probably you would be okay with it. But you do wonder if there were some among the tribe who weren't okay with this custom. But anyway, just something to think about. So that's the law of life. Now let's talk about our friend Stephen Crane. There he is looking all dapper with his mustache. And he lived only from 1871 to 1900, so not even 30 years old. So he died as a very young man. Hold on, let me find him in my book here. All right, his bio is on page 943. Okay. So he grew up in a big family, the last of 14 children, and his parents were very strict. His father was a Methodist minister and was pretty influential, and so Crane actually rejected that. He rejected most religious and social traditions, and his rebellion came through in a lot of different ways. One way is that he wrote a lot of unconventional poetry. Now, we're not reading any of his poetry, but let me just give you a taste of it. Let's see. So, if you look at page 1006, it is interesting that his poetry, and a lot of his poetry, some of it is very, what's the word I'm looking for? Not pornographic, but it was very vivid, sometimes more sexual poetry. But like from the Black writers, God fashioned the ship of the world carefully with the infinite skill of an all-master. Let's see. Well, that's not the one I wanted to read. Oh yeah, sorry, next page, 1008. from war is kind. This is what I wanted to read. It stands in 19. The chatter of a death demon from a treetop, blood, blood, and torn grass had marked the rise of his agony. All right, so he's just a lot of weird stuff, very cryptic, very dark. But he was kind of obsessed with war, and so that came through in his poetry. He was exposed to war as a journalist. He was a war correspondent for a couple of different situations, and that was his first exposure. And in fact, he actually, traveled with, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Making sure I'm saying this correctly here. Yeah. So anyway, that's his exposure to war, and that shows up in his works. Themes of war, violence, poverty. He's most well known for the Red Badge of Courage. Did you guys read the Red Badge of Courage in high school? About the Civil War soldier who struggles with being afraid and actually deserts and goes through this whole, psychological warfare of his mind of what it means to go to war. So, a lot of dark stuff. And he did die very young. He got tuberculosis. Sorry, I can't say my words today. And and he actually died in poverty. He didn't have a whole lot of money. And it's very sad he came to such an early end because he wrote a lot. He wrote several novels, many, many short stories. So we could have had a whole lot more from Crane if he had managed to stay healthy. But there it is. All right, so let's talk about the open boat. Open your books to page 990. So the first thing I want to say about this story is that it is autobiographical in nature. If you look at the footnote at the bottom of page 190, it actually explains that Crane sailed as a correspondent on the steamer Commodore, which sank. All right, so they get out to sea, they sink, and with 3 others, Crane reached Daytona Beach in a 10-foot dinghy on the following morning. All right, so he actually gets his huge steamer ship is swamped, and he and 3 other people survive while most of the crew dies. Okay, so let's talk about the characters. The correspondent, and take note that most of these characters don't have names, which is an interesting thing. So the correspondent, that's Crane, right? That's the point of view from which we get this story, is from the correspondent. He's really the only character that we get into his head and know what he's thinking. So even though it is third person, this is what we call third person limited omniscient, in that we don't get into everybody's head. We really just get into the main character's head, which in this case is the correspondent, whom we don't know his name. And the captain. So the captain was able to escape, and the only thing we really know about him is that he's injured. And so he's unable to help navigate this lifeboat that they're in. But he does still seem to be in charge and giving direction. The oiler, now, I don't know if you guys know how a steamer worked, is that what powered this large vessel on the ocean, where they had these huge engine rooms, where they would feed fuel, I think typically coal, into these huge boilers to create steam to power the ship. And so he worked in the engine room. So by power of deduction, we know that he must have been a very strong man. In fact, he was probably the most fit person on this lifeboat, right? We do know that he had just come to the end of his shift, so he was probably very tired. But he was he was definitely a very fit and able man. And he and the correspondent are the ones who take turns rowing, right? And then finally we have the cook, and all we know about him is that he's fat and he's not much help. So the cook and the captain are just kind of there. The cook helps kind of bail water out of the bottom because it's a little leaky, or they keep getting water coming in. But a lot of people, just to give you some context here, will talk about the open boat as an allegory of life. So, and that's why most of these characters don't have names. The only character who has a name is the oiler, and we know his name is Billy. So an allegory is where you have, so the correspondent, captain, oiler, and cook represent different walks of life, right? And in the open boat, basically their voyage of survival is like the voyage of life. So the ocean is the world. The ocean is their environment. And as they journey through, they're in this tiny little microcosm of a world in their lifeboat. I hope that makes sense. But a lot of people will analyze the story in that way. We are going to look more at the elements of naturalism in the story. And as I said with the law of life, the big thing here is the personification of nature. So let's start with the ocean. So look at page 991. And look at the first full paragraph at the top of the page. A singular disadvantage of the sea lies in the fact that after successfully surmounting one wave, you discover that there is another behind it just as important and just as nervously anxious to do something effective in the way of swamping boats. In a 10-foot dinghy, one can get an idea of the resources of the sea and the line of waves that is not probable to the average experience, which is never at sea in a dinghy. So most people don't get this, right? Because most people haven't been out in the open ocean in a 10-foot small boat. As each slaty wall of water approached, it shut all else from the view of the men in the boat, and it was not difficult to imagine that this particular wave was the final outburst of the ocean, the last effort of the grim water. There was a terrible grace in the move of the waves, and they came in silence, save for the snarling of the crest. So basically the idea that the ocean is trying to take them out, right? The ocean is anxious to swamp their boat. So the ocean in particular is personified as very hostile, right? It's out to get them. This is not a friendly environment, and they have to fight to stay afloat. Does that make sense? So they're in this hostile environment. So let's talk about a few other elements of nature throughout the story. So turn the page to page 992. All right. Another element of nature that pops up is these seagulls, right? The seagulls would show up and just kind of stare them down. Let's see. About halfway down the page 992. Often they, the seagulls, came very close and stared at the men with black bead-like eyes. At these times they were uncanny and sinister in their unblinking scrutiny, and the men hooted angrily at them, telling them to be gone. One bird flew parallel to the boat and did not circle, but made short sidelong jumps in the air in chicken fashion. His black eyes were wistfully fixed upon the captain's head. All right, so the nature, the seagulls, I keep picturing that scene in, is it Finding Nemo, where the crab pops out and they're all like, mine. I don't know, I know that's dumb. But, so they're kind of like these sinister birds, and they want to come land on the men's heads and torture them. So that's portrayed as hostile. And then, if you get further in the story, the other element of nature they have a run-in with is a shark, right? So this is on page, let's see. Where's the shark? Well, I can't find it marked in my book, but if you guys read it, you know there's a shark, and it circles them at night, and they have to kind of beat it off. I can't find where it was. Anyway, so in general, nature is portrayed as hostile towards the men. Okay, so a bunch of stuff happens, and this is a long story. Hopefully you read the whole thing. And what's really sad is at the one point, they think they're going to get close, right? Like they see the lighthouse, and they have hope, but let's see. Yeah, they get to the lighthouse, and sorry, I'm trying to find this one place. Yes, here we go. Page 996, 997. All right, so they get close to shore, and they actually see people, right, on the shore, but the people are no help, right? Look at page 998. It says they're talking back and forth about what's going on there. Let's see. About 10 lines in. It looks as if he were trying to tell us to go north. There must be a life-saving station up there. No, he thinks we're fishing. Just giving us a merry hand, see? Ah, there, Willie. Well, I wish I could make something out of those signals. What do you suppose he means? He don't mean anything. He's just playing. Well, if he'd just signal us to try the surf again, or to go see and wait, or go north or south, or go to hell, there would be some reason in it. But look at them. He just stands there and keeps his coat revolving like a wheel. All right, so, you know, they get so close. They can see people, they can see the shore, but it's like there's no hope right there, right? Like these people are not helpful, and they end up having to spend the night at sea, which is not fun at all, right? And this, I believe, is where they finally do, yeah, they do see the shark at the top of page 1001. All right, so as they spend longer and longer, there's this one chorus that keeps popping up, and we need to talk about this. So look at page 1001, chapter 6, if you will. All right, so at the beginning of this chapter, it says, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, if I am going to be drowned, why in the name of the 7 mad gods who rule the sea was I allowed to come thus far and contemplate sand and trees? So basically, like, if I'm going to die anyway, why did the universe give me such hope? Does that make sense? Why was I allowed to survive? Why didn't I just go down with a steamer? Why did I have to suffer through this if my end is going to be death? And so really asking that eternal human question of, why am I here? What am I doing here? What is this? Look at the next paragraph. During this dismal night, it may be remarked that a man would conclude that it was really the intention of the 7 mad gods to drown him, despite the abominable injustice of it. For it was certainly an abominable injustice to drown a man who had worked so hard. The man felt it would be a crime most unnatural. All right, and then if you look at the next paragraph, this is an important quote. When it occurs to a man that nature does not regard him as important, and that she feels she would not maim the universe by disposing of him, he at first wishes to throw bricks at the temple, and he hates deeply the fact that there are no bricks and no temples. Any visible expression of nature would surely be pelleted with his jeers. All right, so this is kind of like an epiphany. So it occurs to the correspondent that nature does not care about him, right? Nature, as this force, this very powerful force in the world, does not regard him as important. And that angers him. He says, I want to throw bricks at the temple. And what does a temple represent but the idea of a god, right? But he says, then there are no bricks and no temples. For this naturalist worldview doesn't really leave room for a god because it's all left up to fate. It's all predetermined. The highest importance is given to the force of nature, the hostile environment of the world. And so basically, like, he's powerless in the face of this fatalism. There's nothing he can do. So he wants to throw a brick at the temples, and he hates deeply the fact that there are no bricks and no temples. There's nothing he can do in this situation. So those first few paragraphs in chapter 6 are pretty central to this overall theme of the story here. So one interesting thing, and we'll flip back a little bit here, is, and I like this, how Crane actually gives us a little bit of hope in this very dark naturalist story, and that is in how the men treat each other. And if you look back at page 993, and I think you can trace this throughout the story, but the beginning of chapter 3, all right, it says, "It would be difficult to describe the subtle brotherhood of men that was here established on the seas. No one said that it was so, no one mentioned it, but it dwelt in the boat, and each man felt it warm him. They were a captain, an oiler, a cook, and a correspondent, and they were friends. Friends in a more curiously iron-bound degree than may be common." So basically, one effect of this hostile environment is that it created this beautiful camaraderie among the men, this brotherhood, as Crane calls it. And so that's something that's really neat about how Crane gives us a couple shades of hope in this otherwise dark story, that even though they are fated to live and one of them die in this very hostile, dark situation, they do have this humanity in how they come together. All right, so let's talk about the roles of fate and irony. Two big ideas. In fact, I would say that overall, probably one of the major themes in this story is the idea of fate, this fatalistic idea. And we'll talk about this in a couple different ways. All right, so the first element is the indifference of nature. We've already talked about that a little bit, but let me read you a little more. Look at page 996. So this is when they're about to first, maybe attempt to go to shore, but then they can't. But they, they're like, well, if we die, they kind of exchange messages, like, if I die, tell my wife this. Top of page 996. They then briefly exchanged some addresses and admonitions. As for the reflections of the men, there was a great deal of rage in them. Perchance they might be formulated thus, and here we have the chorus again. If I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned. So I'm not going to read the same thing. About 3 lines down. Was I brought here merely to have my nose dragged away as I was about to nibble the sacred cheese of life? It is preposterous. If this old ninny woman, Fate, cannot do better than this, she should be deprived of the management of men's fortunes. So basically the idea of fate is in charge. This is the main theme in this story, is that they don't have choice and that nature is indifferent to them. So, and their reaction to that is anger, and they react in kind. If nature is hostile, then they react hostilely, but they're fairly powerless with any choice in the situation. So the lack of choice is a big one. And there's a lot of irony in this. So let's look at the end of the story. Let's see. Look at page 1004 and 1005. So this is when they finally decide to go for it in the really rough surf. So they know that when they get to these bigger waves closer to shore, the ship is going to turn, their little boat is going to crash, and they're going to have to swim for it. All right. So bottom of page 1004. Let's see. The January water was icy, and he reflected immediately that it was colder than he had expected to find off the coast of Florida. This appeared to his dazed mind as an important fact enough to be noted at the time. All right, so it's really cold. It's not good. Bottom of the page. When he came to the surface, he was conscious of little but the noisy water. Afterward, he saw his companions in the sea. The oiler was ahead in the race. He was swimming strongly and rapidly. So as we said before, the oiler is the most fit one. So he seems to be most likely to make it at the end. And again, we're getting the viewpoint of the correspondent here. Page 1005, about second paragraph down. But finally he arrived at a place in the sea where travel was beset with difficulty. He did not pause swimming to inquire what manner of current had caught him, but there his progress ceased. So he gets caught in this riptide or whatever, and he can't get closer to the shore. He's stuck in this current. And Crane even talks about the current as his enemy. He personifies it. And he asks himself again, if I'm going to drown, is this it? I've come all this way and then I'm going to drown? Look towards the end of the page. Bottom of page 1005. Last few paragraphs. In his struggle to reach the captain in the boat, he reflected that when one gets properly wearied, drowning must really be a comfortable arrangement, a cessation of his hostilities accompanied by a large degree of relief, and he was glad of it. So it's well, maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Very bottom of the page. Captain says, come to the boat. All right, Captain. As the correspondent paddled, he saw the captain let himself down to the bottom and leave the boat. Then the correspondent performed his one little marvel of the voyage. A large wave caught him and flung him with ease and supreme speed completely over the boat and far beyond it. It struck him even then as an event in gymnastics and a true miracle of the sea. An overturned boat in the surf is not a plaything to a swimming man. So what actually saves him from crashing into their boat and being stuck in this current is an ocean wave. So there's no element whatsoever of him getting to the shore, getting to safety by his own power, under his own will. He has no choice in the matter. It's just up to nature. Which leads us to, at the very end, they all make it except for the oiler, which is incredibly ironic that the most fit one actually did not survive. And so what Crane is emphasizing as far as naturalism in this story is not so much survival of the fittest, but the indifference of nature, right? The idea of fatalism. Remember I talked about fate being the main theme here? As strong as the oiler was, it was not his fate to survive this shipwreck. Even the fat cook and the injured captain were able to get to shore. So it had nothing to do with their power, with their choices. It all had to do with what was fated to happen. And so, kind of a sad story. And it's also ironic that here at the end, they finally get to shore, right? And then all the people show up, right? So it's all of a sudden there's all these people on the beach to help them. It's well, where were you, 5 hours ago? They've been waiting for help all this time. And when they finally really no longer need help, they've made it to shore, all these people show up. So a lot of irony throughout, and again, really emphasizing and underscoring this main theme of fate and the power of nature, and how in a lot of ways nature is hostile, but just as equally nature is indifferent towards these men. Really emphasizing how the men are not significant in light of the entire universe. So, sorry we have to end on such kind of a bummer note here, but that's what the naturalists were like. It was pretty negative worldview. So let me know if you have any questions about your test or whatever's coming up, and I hope you'll have a good week.